The spotlight was blinding. 5-year-old Michael Jackson stood on stage at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, his small body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The crowd roared as he grabbed the microphone, his voice carrying a power that seemed impossible for someone so young. But while thousands cheered, Michael felt something else entirely. He felt the weight of expectations, the pressure to be perfect, and the terror of disappointing the one man whose approval he desperately craved, his father, Joseph Jackson. Behind the dazzling performances and chart-topping hits, Michael's childhood was slipping away like sand through his fingers. While other kids played in parks and rode bicycles, Michael rehearsed dance moves until his feet bled. While his classmates whispered about crushes and cartoons, Michael was learning how to control a stadium full of screaming fans. Joseph Jackson ran the household like a military operation, and failure was not an option. Mistakes during rehearsal meant punishment, sometimes verbal, often physical. The belt was a constant threat, a shadow that loomed over every misstep and every flat note. Michael would later recall looking out of his window in Gary, Indiana, watching neighborhood children play. Their laughter echoed through the streets while he stood inside, forbidden from joining them. Music was his life, but it was also his prison. The Jackson 5 became a sensation, and with each success, the bars of that prison grew stronger. There were no lazy Saturday mornings, no birthday parties with friends, no simple joys that most children take for granted. Instead, there were recording sessions that lasted until dawn, performances that required adult-level professionalism, and a father who saw his children not as kids, but as investments. The smile that would later become Michael's trademark began here, in these early years. It was a mask he learned to wear because showing fear or sadness was weakness, and weakness was punished. When cameras flashed, Michael smiled. When journalists asked questions, Michael smiled. When his body ached from exhaustion and his heart ached from loneliness, Michael smiled. It became second nature, a reflex as automatic as breathing. But behind that smile, a wound was forming, a deep, aching emptiness that no amount of success could fill. Joseph Jackson believed he was preparing his sons for greatness, but what he was actually doing was teaching them that love was conditional. Affection came only after perfection was achieved. A hug was earned through a flawless performance. Pride was shown only when the crowds applauded. For Michael, who possessed an extraordinary sensitivity and a heart that felt everything deeply, this conditional love became a poison that would seep into every aspect of his life. He learned to associate his worth with his talent, to measure his value by the volume of applause. Without an audience, who was he? Without the music, what was he worth? The Jackson 5's success exploded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. They signed with Motown Records, and suddenly, Michael wasn't just a local sensation, he was a national treasure. His face appeared on magazine covers, his voice poured out of radios across America, and his moves were imitated by millions. But with each new level of fame, Michael drifted further from the childhood he would never experience. The innocent boy from Gary, Indiana, was being transformed into something else entirely, a commodity, a brand, a legend. And legends don't get to be children. Legends don't get to make mistakes. Legends don't get to cry. At night, when the applause faded and the lights dimmed, Michael lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He could still hear the echo of his father's voice, criticizing his performance, demanding better, pushing harder. He could still feel the sting of disappointment when a note wasn't quite right. And he wondered if anyone loved him for who he was, or only for what he could do. That question would haunt him for the rest of his life, driving decisions that the world would never fully understand. The smile remained firmly in place, growing brighter as the pain grew deeper. Michael Jackson stared at his reflection, but the face looking back at him felt like a stranger's. He was in his 20s now, and Thriller had just transformed him from a superstar into a global phenomenon. The album broke every record imaginable, spawned music videos that were more like short films, and established Michael as the undisputed king of pop. The world worshipped him. Yet that same world had begun to whisper about his appearance, and those whispers cut deeper than any critic's review ever could. The relationship Michael had with his reflection was complicated and painful. As a child, Joseph Jackson had mocked his appearance, particularly his nose, calling it too wide and making cruel jokes that no child should ever hear from a parent. Those words burrowed into Michael's psyche, creating an insecurity that would shape decades of his life. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see the man millions found captivating. He saw the flaws his father had pointed out, magnified 1,000 times. The nose became an obsession, a symbol of everything he felt was wrong with himself. The first surgery was supposed to fix everything. Then came the second. Then a third. Each time, Michael believed this would be the one that finally made him feel acceptable, that would quiet the critical voice in his head that sounded eerily like his father. But plastic surgery became a trap, a cycle he couldn't escape. The more he changed his appearance, the more the media focused on it, and the more he felt compelled to change again. It was never enough. He was never enough. The man who could command a stage and hold millions in the palm of his hand felt powerless when confronted with his own image. But the changes went beyond physical appearance. Michael's entire relationship with reality was beginning to shift. The Neverland Ranch, which he purchased in 1987, became both his sanctuary and his isolation chamber. Named after the magical place where Peter Pan and the Lost Boys never had to grow up, Neverland was Michael's attempt to reclaim the childhood that had been stolen from him. He filled it with amusement park rides, a zoo, a movie theater, and arcade games. It was a fantasy world where he could finally be the child he never was allowed to be. To the outside world, Neverland seemed bizarre, a grown man surrounding himself with childish things. But to Michael, it was salvation. Within those gates, he didn't have to be the king of pop. He didn't have to be perfect. He could ride the roller coaster, play with the animals, and laugh without worrying about his image. Yet this retreat from reality came with a cost. The more time Michael spent in his fantasy world, the harder it became to exist in the real one. He began sleeping in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, convinced it would help him live longer. He befriended a chimpanzee named Bubbles and treated him like a companion. The line between eccentricity and something more troubling began to blur. The media, which had once celebrated Michael's every move, now turned on him with vicious enthusiasm. Tabloids printed increasingly outrageous stories, that he slept in the hyperbaric chamber, that he tried to buy the Elephant Man's bones, that he was bleaching his skin. Some stories were exaggerations of truth, others were complete fabrications, but Michael's increasing reclusiveness made it impossible to separate fact from fiction. He became Wacko Jacko, a tabloid punchline, a freak show for public consumption. Every appearance was scrutinized, every change documented, every eccentricity mocked. The truth about his changing skin color was actually medical. Michael suffered from vitiligo, a condition that destroys pigmentation in the skin, creating patches of discoloration. Rather than appear blotchy, he used makeup and treatments to even out his skin tone. But explaining this felt impossible when the narrative had already been written. The tabloids didn't want the truth. They wanted the spectacle. And Michael, who had been trained since childhood to give audiences what they wanted, found himself trapped in a performance he never auditioned for, the role of the tragic, bizarre celebrity spiraling out of control. Depression wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket. Despite the mansions, the awards, the wealth, and the fame, Michael was profoundly lonely. His relationships were complicated by the fact that he could never be certain if people loved him or loved his celebrity. Trust became impossible. Genuine connection felt like a distant memory. He surrounded himself with yes-men and employees who depended on him for their livelihoods, people who would never challenge him or tell him hard truths. The isolation grew more complete with each passing year, and the smile he wore for cameras grew more strained, more obviously a performance. The phone call came on August 17, 1993, and in an instant, Michael Jackson's world imploded. 13-year-old Jordan Chandler, the son of a dentist named Evan Chandler, had accused Michael of sexual abuse. The news spread like wildfire, and suddenly, the man who had spent his entire life entertaining the world was being painted as a monster. Everything Michael had built, his reputation, his legacy, his carefully maintained image, crumbled in the face of these accusations. The smile disappeared completely. For Michael, who genuinely loved children and identified with their innocence, the accusations felt like a betrayal of cosmic proportions. He had always been open about his affection for kids, seeing in them the purity and joy that had been stolen from his own childhood. He invited children to Neverland, gave them experiences they would never forget, and genuinely believed he was making their lives better. To have this interpreted as something sinister, something evil, shattered him in ways that even his traumatic childhood hadn't managed. The media frenzy was unlike anything the world had seen. Camera crews camped outside every property Michael owned. Helicopters circled Neverland, trying to capture footage of the embattled star. Every news program led with the story. Late-night talk shows made jokes. The presumption of innocence seemed to vanish in the face of such sensational accusations. Michael was tried and convicted in the court of public opinion long before any legal proceedings began. The tabloids that had once simply mocked his eccentricities now painted him as a predator, and millions of people who had grown up with his music suddenly questioned everything they thought they knew about him. The investigation was invasive in ways that are difficult to imagine. Police obtained a search warrant for Neverland and raided the property, looking for evidence. They photographed Michael's body, documenting every mark in detail, searching for anything that matched the descriptions Jordan Chandler had provided. The humiliation was complete. Michael, who already had profound issues with his body image and appearance, was stripped and examined like a suspect in a crime scene. The psychological damage from this violation would never fully heal. Behind closed doors, something else was happening, a negotiation that would haunt Michael for the rest of his life. Evan Chandler, Jordan's father, was demanding money. Before going public with the accusations, he had asked Michael for $20 million to finance film projects. When Michael refused, the accusations followed. Now, with a civil lawsuit filed and a criminal investigation underway, Michael faced an impossible choice. His lawyers advised him that fighting the case could take years, cost millions in legal fees, and keep him trapped in a nightmare with no guarantee of vindication. The safer option, they said, was to settle the civil case and move forward. In January 1994, Michael paid approximately $22 million to the Chandler family to settle the civil lawsuit. The criminal investigation continued for several more months but eventually concluded without charges being filed, partly because Jordan Chandler declined to testify. To many observers, the settlement looked like an admission of guilt. Why would an innocent man pay such an enormous sum? But those close to Michael knew the truth was more complicated. He was exhausted, broken, and desperate to escape the constant scrutiny. He wanted his life back, even if it meant paying a price he shouldn't have had to pay. The settlement bought silence but not peace. Michael's reputation was permanently damaged. Radio stations pulled his music. Endorsement deals evaporated. The public that had once adored him now viewed him with suspicion and disgust. And Michael himself was never the same. The light that had once shone from him, even through the pain, dimmed significantly. He became more reclusive, more paranoid, more convinced that the world was against him. The accusations confirmed his deepest fear, that people saw him as a monster rather than the wounded child he truly was. Friends and family watched helplessly as Michael spiraled. He turned increasingly to prescription medications to cope with the anxiety, depression, and physical pain that plagued him. Painkillers became his refuge, a chemical escape from a reality that had become unbearable. Sleep was impossible without pharmaceutical assistance. Functioning required a careful balance of medications that became harder to maintain with each passing year. The addiction that would ultimately contribute to his death was taking root, fed by trauma and enabled by doctors who were either too intimidated or too greedy to say no. Michael Jackson believed that love could heal him. After the devastation of the 1993 accusations, he sought salvation in the arms of Lisa Marie Presley, daughter of Elvis Presley and a woman who understood the burden of living under an impossible legacy. They married in May 1994 in a secret ceremony in the Dominican Republic, and for a brief moment, Michael allowed himself to hope that this relationship might be the answer to his lifelong loneliness. Lisa Marie was strong, opinionated, and unafraid of Michael's fame. She saw through the celebrity to the broken man underneath, and she genuinely cared for him. The marriage was intense and complicated from the beginning. Lisa Marie tried desperately to help Michael, to pull him away from the enablers and yes-men who surrounded him, to get him proper help for his addiction to painkillers. She saw what was happening and fought against it with everything she had. But Michael's relationship with medication was already deeply entrenched. The pills weren't just about physical pain, they were about emotional survival. They quieted the voices of self-doubt, numbed the trauma, and made it possible to function despite the weight of everything he carried. Asking him to give them up was asking him to face his demons unprotected, and he wasn't ready for that battle. Their relationship played out in the public eye in ways that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. When they appeared together at the MTV Video Music Awards, sharing an awkward kiss on stage, the world mocked them. Commentators questioned whether the marriage was real or merely a publicity stunt designed to rehabilitate Michael's damaged image. Every appearance was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed, every moment of affection questioned. The constant scrutiny put enormous pressure on a relationship that was already struggling under the weight of Michael's trauma and addiction. Lisa Marie wanted children with Michael. She believed that becoming a father might give him purpose and help him heal. But Michael, who loved children yet feared being a parent, hesitated. His own father had damaged him so profoundly that the thought of repeating those patterns terrified him. What if he failed? What if he hurt his child the way he had been hurt? The fear paralyzed him, creating friction in the marriage. Lisa Marie grew frustrated with Michael's inability to commit to building a family, and the distance between them widened. By 1996, the marriage was over. They divorced after less than 2 years together, and for Michael, it was another confirmation that he was fundamentally unlovable. If someone like Lisa Marie, who understood fame and genuinely cared for him, couldn't make it work, then perhaps nothing would. The failure of the marriage drove him deeper into isolation and further into the arms of his pharmaceutical escape. The brief window of hope closed, and the darkness returned with renewed intensity. Michael's next marriage, to Debbie Rowe in 1996, was entirely different in nature. Debbie was a dermatology nurse who had been treating Michael for his vitiligo. She offered him something Lisa Marie had wanted to give him but couldn't: children. The relationship was less about romantic love and more about Michael's desperate desire to become a father, to prove that he could nurture and protect in ways his own father never had. Debbie gave birth to Prince Michael Jackson in 1997 and Paris Michael Catherine Jackson in 1998. A third child, Prince Michael Jackson II, known as Blanket, would come later through surrogacy. Fatherhood transformed Michael in unexpected ways. With his children, he experienced a love that was pure and unconditional. He doted on them obsessively, protecting them from the outside world with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. He covered their faces with masks and veils when they appeared in public, determined to give them the privacy he had never enjoyed. He homeschooled them at Neverland, creating a bubble where they could be innocent and protected. In his children, Michael found purpose and a form of redemption. He could give them the childhood he never had, could be the father Joseph Jackson had never been. But the protective measures that made sense to Michael looked bizarre to the outside world. When he dangled baby Blanket over a hotel balcony railing in Berlin in 2002, trying to show him to fans, the world erupted in outrage. Michael claimed he was simply caught up in the moment, excited to share his joy with his supporters. But the image of an infant being held over a dangerous drop became another piece of evidence that Michael was unfit, unstable, and irresponsible. The man who loved his children more than anything was now being portrayed as a danger to them. The divorce from Debbie Rowe in 1999 gave Michael full custody of Prince and Paris. Debbie essentially stepped away from motherhood, later stating that she had the children for Michael, not for herself. This arrangement suited Michael perfectly. He could be the sole parent, the only important figure in his children's lives. But it also meant that the entire burden of raising them fell on his shoulders, and he was already crumbling under the weight of his own struggles. The children became both his greatest source of joy and another source of anxiety, another responsibility he feared failing. The second wave of accusations hit in 2003 like a tsunami, and this time, there would be no settlement, no escape route, no way to avoid the full force of the legal system. 13-year-old Gavin Arvizo accused Michael of sexual abuse, and the Santa Barbara district attorney, who had long suspected Michael despite the lack of charges from the earlier investigation, pursued the case with aggressive determination. Michael was arrested, fingerprinted, photographed, and charged with multiple counts of child molestation. The mugshot that circulated showed a man who looked nothing like the confident king of pop. His expression was hollow, defeated, barely holding together. The trial began in January 2005 and lasted 5 months, becoming a media circus that made the earlier scandal look tame by comparison. Every day, cameras captured Michael arriving at the courthouse, and every day, his physical deterioration was more apparent. He appeared painfully thin, his movements slow and labored. Some days he arrived in pajamas, having been hospitalized that morning. The medication he relied on to function was failing him, or perhaps he was failing it, the doses escalating to dangerous levels just to get through each day. His lawyers worried he might not survive the trial, regardless of the verdict. The prosecution painted Michael as a predator who used his fame and fortune to lure vulnerable children into his web. They brought witness after witness, describing inappropriate behavior, questionable situations, and disturbing patterns. But the defense systematically dismantled the credibility of the accusers, revealing financial motivations, inconsistent stories, and evidence that suggested coaching. Gavin Arvizo's mother, in particular, came across as unreliable and possibly manipulative, with a history of making false claims for financial gain. The jury was left with reasonable doubt, and in June 2005, Michael was acquitted on all counts. The verdict should have been a moment of triumph, a vindication that Michael desperately needed. Instead, it was simply the end of an ordeal that had destroyed whatever was left of him. He was found not guilty, but he wasn't found innocent in the court of public opinion. Many people believed the acquittal was the result of celebrity justice, that Michael's wealth and fame had bought him freedom. Others believed he was genuinely innocent but acknowledged that his behavior with children, while perhaps not criminal, was inappropriate and concerning. The ambiguity would follow him forever, a shadow that could never be fully dispelled. Michael left the United States after the trial, unable to bear living in the country that had put him through such hell. He wandered through Bahrain, Ireland, and other locations, a ghost of his former self. Neverland Ranch, once his sanctuary, was closed down and eventually abandoned. He couldn't bring himself to return to the place that had been raided by police, where his private world had been violated and examined for evidence of crimes he maintained he never committed. The dream of remaining forever young, of creating a space where innocence could be preserved, died with the trial. Financial problems mounted as Michael's ability to generate income diminished. The trial had cost tens of millions in legal fees. His spending habits, always excessive, had never been reined in. Properties were mortgaged, assets were leveraged, and debts accumulated. The man who had once been worth hundreds of millions found himself in financial crisis, facing potential bankruptcy. In a desperate attempt to solve his money problems and perhaps reclaim his legacy, Michael agreed to a series of comeback concerts at the O2 Arena in London. This is it was announced as his final curtain call, a chance for the world to see him perform one last time. Rehearsals for the concerts began in 2009, and those who worked with Michael during this period saw a man fighting desperately to recapture his magic while battling a body that was failing him. He was 50 years old but looked decades older, worn down by years of medication abuse, stress, and unresolved trauma. He struggled with choreography that would have been effortless in his youth. His voice, once powerful and distinctive, was weaker, requiring more technological enhancement. But there were moments, brief, shining moments, when the old Michael appeared, when the music took over and he moved with the grace that had defined his career. Those moments gave everyone hope that maybe, just maybe, he could pull off this final comeback. Behind the scenes, Dr. Conrad Murray was administering propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic, to help Michael sleep. The insomnia that had plagued him for years had reached unbearable levels. Michael's body and mind, conditioned by decades of performance anxiety and trauma, simply would not allow rest. Propofol became his only escape, a pharmaceutical oblivion that allowed him a few hours of unconsciousness. Murray, who was being paid $150,000 per month, agreed to provide this dangerous drug outside of a medical facility, without proper monitoring equipment, despite knowing the risks. It was medical recklessness bordering on homicide, but Michael was desperate, and Murray was willing. On June 25, 2009, Murray administered propofol to Michael in his rented mansion in Los Angeles. At some point, Michael stopped breathing. Murray's attempts at resuscitation were inadequate, his call to emergency services was delayed, and by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Michael Jackson was pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center at 2:26 p.m. The official cause of death was acute propofol intoxication combined with benzodiazepines. Murray would later be convicted of involuntary manslaughter, but the conviction felt hollow to those who loved Michael. Murray was just the final chapter in a lifetime of people who had failed Michael Jackson. The world's reaction to Michael's death was immediate and overwhelming. Millions mourned, gathering in spontaneous memorials around the globe. Radio stations played his music on continuous loops. Social media crashed under the weight of grief and remembrance. People who had mocked him, doubted him, and turned away from him now remembered only the music, the magic, the moments when he had made them feel something extraordinary. The complicated, troubled man was simplified into the legend, and the legend was universally grieved. His memorial service at the Staples Center was watched by billions, a testament to his impact on global culture. But beneath the public mourning, questions lingered. Questions about whether Michael was guilty or innocent, whether his eccentricities were symptoms of mental illness or merely the quirks of genius, whether he was a victim or had victimized others. These questions have never been fully answered and perhaps never will be. What remains undeniable is that Michael Jackson was a profoundly damaged person who suffered immensely despite, or perhaps because of, his extraordinary talent. The smile he wore for the cameras was never the full truth. Behind it lay a pain so deep that not even worldwide adoration could heal it. The children Michael left behind, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, grew up with the complicated legacy of being Michael Jackson's kids. They've spoken publicly about their father, describing a loving, devoted parent who tried to give them normalcy despite his own chaos. They remember bedtime stories, laughter, and a man who prioritized them above everything else. Their memories suggest that whatever Michael's flaws and struggles, his love for them was genuine and transformative. In the end, perhaps that's the most important thing, that despite everything that was broken in him, he found a way to love purely and completely. The final truth about Michael Jackson is that we'll never have all the answers. We'll never know with absolute certainty what happened behind closed doors, what was real and what was manipulation, where eccentricity ended and pathology began. What we do know is that a 5-year-old boy was put on stage and never allowed to step off it, that the applause he received could never fill the emptiness left by conditional love, that fame and fortune offered no protection against the demons that haunted him. The smile he wore became his prison, a mask he could never fully remove because the world demanded the performance even when the performer was dying inside. Michael Jackson's story is a tragedy in the classical sense, a tale of extraordinary talent and profound suffering, of a person destroyed by the very things that made him special. It's a reminder that the people we watch on stage are human, that behind every performance is a person with wounds we cannot see and pain we cannot imagine. And it's a warning about what happens when we demand perfection from those we admire, when we consume their art while ignoring their humanity, when we build legends and then destroy the people who carry them. The smile is frozen now in photographs and videos, preserved forever for generations to analyze and interpret. But the man behind the smile is gone, taking his full truth with him. What remains is the music, the moves, and the eternal question of whether we loved Michael Jackson or simply loved what he could do for us. That question, more than any other, might be his most painful legacy.